Welcome to the deep dive. Think about this for a second. Every single day, literally thousands of people around the world, they go to work and they just don't come home. Fatal accidents.
It's a shocking number.
It really is. And that's before you even count the hundreds of millions who get sick or injured because of their job each year. It's just this huge global problem.
Yes.
So it makes you wonder, right? We have all this safety knowledge, all these solutions. Why are the numbers still so stubbornly high?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And maybe more personally, have you ever seen like a really great safety idea, something that worked brilliantly somewhere else?
Yeah.
And then you try to bring it into your own place and it just bombs, completely falls flat.
Oh, absolutely. Seen it happen more than once. It's frustrating.
Exactly. That's the puzzle we're kind of digging into today. We've been looking at some research that really tries to unpack why these safety interventions, these great ideas, often fail when you move them, even when they look perfect on paper.
Right. It seems like it should be straightforward, but it rarely is.
So our mission for this deep dive, we want to give you a clear picture of why this happens, and we're going to lean on this pretty interesting field called translation theory to get some insights, hopefully help make safety improvements actually stick wherever you might be trying them.
It's a really vital area. Because, like you said, we assume good ideas travel easily, especially for something as important as keeping people safe. But the reality, well, it tells a different story.
Okay, let's get into this translation theory then. Now, first off, when we say translation here, we're not just talking about language, like English to Spanish for a safety sign, are we?
No, not at all. It's much broader than that. Think of it more like transplanting something living, maybe an organ, rather than just copying text.
Okay, like moving something complex.
Exactly. It's about how these safety ideas, these practices, how they physically move, yes, but also how they get understood or maybe misunderstood in a new place, and crucially, how they change during that journey. It's the whole life cycle of the idea as it travels.
A journey?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. And I bet that journey isn't always smooth sailing.
Definitely not.
The research we looked at really hammers home this point. Safety ideas aren't just abstract concepts. They're often, deeply tangled up with the specific place where they started.
Embedded?
Yeah, embedded. It talks about needing to sort of disembed the idea first, pull it out of its original home
Right.
before it can travel, and then be re-embedded somewhere new. That sounds way more involved than just, emailing a procedure.
It really is. It's definitely not a simple cut and paste job. Think about translating a novel, maybe. You're not just swapping words one for one. You're trying to recreate the feeling, the nuance, the cultural context for a totally different audience. Safety ideas are kind of similar. They carry the baggage or maybe the wisdom of where they came from.
That's a great analogy. And this translation process apparently has different facets. The paper mentions geometric, semiotic, and political dimensions. Can you unpack those a bit for us? What do they actually mean on the ground?
Sure. Let's break it down. The geometric part is probably the simplest. It's just the physical movement. The idea goes from organization A to organization B, or maybe from headquarters to a local site.
Okay, the travel itself.
Right. Then the semiotic dimension is all about meaning. How is this idea interpreted when it lands in the new place? Does safety culture mean the same thing to the engineers in R&D as it does to the folks on the shop floor? That shift in understanding, that's the semiotic bit.
So how people actually understand it.
Exactly. And then there's the political dimension. This acknowledges that, ideas don't land in a vacuum. There are power dynamics. Who's pushing for this change? Who's resisting it? Whose budget is it coming out of? All those internal politics and persuasion games heavily influence whether an idea gets adopted or just ignored.
Wow. Okay, so it's the idea, its journey, and the whole social landscape it arrives in. That's complicated.
It is.
Now, here's something that really jumped out at me from the research, this concept of interpretive viability.
Ah, yes. That's interesting.
It suggests that sometimes a little bit of fuzziness, some ambiguity in the safety intervention itself can actually be a good thing. It lets people in different spots adapt it to what they need. That feels wrong somehow. You'd think super clear, rigid instructions would be best, wouldn't you?
It does seem counterintuitive, I agree. But think about it. If a safety procedure is incredibly specific, down to the last detail designed for factory A, Well, it might just not work in Factory B because they have slightly different equipment or a different workflow or maybe even different regulations.
Okay, yeah.
So a little bit of flexibility, that interpretive viability,
Mm.
it allows the local team to say, okay, we get the goal, the what, but how we achieve it needs to look slightly different here. It lets them take ownership and make it fit their reality.
So it's about finding that balance. Keep the core principle, but allow tweaking on the application.
Exactly that. It's finding the sweet spot. Too rigid, it breaks. Too vague, it means nothing. But just enough flexibility allows for smart adaptation.
That's a really useful insight. A bit of wiggle room isn't necessarily bad. Okay, so who are the main actors in this whole translation game? It sounds like it's not just a top-down thing.
Oh, definitely not. Translation is happening all over the place.
Yeah.
You've got what the researchers call field-level translation. This is where, big ideas or best practices kind of emerge across an entire industry. Think about safety standards that come out of industry conferences or expert bodies.
Right, like maybe a standard approach to risk assessment that most companies in, say, construction start to adopt.
Precisely. That's field level. But then a huge amount of translation happens within organizations, and this is often driven by managers, safety professionals, people on the ground.
Okay.
And the research really stresses how important it is for these people to have translation competence.
Translation competence. Okay, that sounds like a key skill. What does that actually involve? What does someone with this competence do?
It's kind of a package deal.
Mm.
First, they really need to understand the original idea inside out. Where did it come from? Why did it work there? What are its core elements?
Got it. Know the source material.
Second, they need deep knowledge of the new place, the recipient context. What's the culture like? What systems are already in place? What are the likely challenges or points of resistance?
Know your audience, essentially.
Exactly. And third, they need the skill to figure out how to bridge the gap. Can we just copy this thing directly? Do we need to tweak it a bit, modify it? Or does this situation actually call for a completely different approach, maybe inspired by the original, but fundamentally altered? They need to make that judgment call.
So it's understanding the original, understanding the destination, and then being smart about how you adapt the message for that specific journey. Okay, that gives us a good handle on the theory. Let's shift gears. How did the researchers actually study this in the real world? What were their methods?
All right, so they didn't just theorize. They went out and talked to people. Specifically, they interviewed 17 experienced managers. These were people with real safety responsibilities in various big industries: oil and gas, retail, telecoms, manufacturing, operating globally.
So people really in the trenches dealing with this stuff day to day.
Exactly. These weren't academics guessing. These were practitioners sharing their actual experiences.
And what did they share?
Each manager provided detailed stories or narratives about specific safety interventions. They focused on 8 different types of interventions in total, describing times they had tried to implement them either in a new company or just a different part of their own large organization.
8 different interventions. Wow. That must have given them a really rich set of examples. What kinds of things were they looking at?
It was a good mix, which is helpful. They looked at frameworks for checking employee competency for safety-critical roles.
Okay, skills assessments.
Yeah. Things like HACCP reviews, that's a structured way to identify hazards, common in process industries. Also, manual handling training programs, lifting safely.
Right.
Plus, tools for assessing and tracking risks, specific software systems for managing safety data, and even really broad initiatives trying to change the whole safety culture of an organization. Oh, and a couple more specific ones, like a dedicated site for testing competency and a redesigned safety training approach.
So a real range from specific tools and training to these big, complex culture change efforts. How did they make sense of all those stories? That sounds like a lot of qualitative data.
They use a structured analysis technique called the framework method. Basically, they developed a framework based on the concepts from translation theory, things like translatability, transformability, context, actors, and then systematically went through all the narratives, coding them against that framework.
So they were looking for common patterns, applying the theory lens to the real-world stories.
Exactly. It allowed them to compare experiences across different interventions and different company contexts and see what themes kept emerging about what helped or hindered the transfer process.
Okay, makes sense. So they did all that analysis. Let's get to the juicy part. What did they find? What were the big discoveries about why some interventions make the jump successfully and others, well, don't?
Well, one of the first things that hit them, and it's quite striking, was that the interventions that looked easy to transfer on paper didn't always succeed.
Really?
Yeah, things that seemed low complexity, not too tied to the original place, really well documented. You'd think they'd be slam dunks for you.
Absolutely. You'd bet on those every time.
But it wasn't that simple. Success in the new setting wasn't guaranteed just because the intervention itself seemed easy to move. That really challenges some common assumptions.
It sure does. Can you give us some examples from the study? How did this play out with those specific interventions?
Definitely. Let's take that competency assessment framework, intervention I-1. It was meant for a large organization, checking skills for safety-critical jobs.
Right.
Now, when they rolled it out across the company's airports around the world, it actually worked reasonably well.
Okay, why there?
Well, the airport environment was generally quite hierarchical. People were already very aware of hazards. And crucially, the local airport managers were given some leeway to adapt the framework a bit. Plus, and this seemed important, they had a specific person, a champion, who actively went around talking to senior managers, getting their buy-in.
Ah, the champion role. Okay, so hierarchy, hazard awareness, local flexibility, and a champion. Sounds good. But what happened when they tried the same framework in the company's retail gas stations?
Yeah, not so much success there. The retail side was much more focused on sales, hitting targets. There was pushback against what they saw as just another mandate from headquarters.
Yeah.
It felt like the two parts of the business operated in totally different worlds, almost. So, same framework, seemingly quite translatable on the surface, but the different organizational contexts, different priorities, they made a huge difference to how well it was received and used.
That's a stark contrast. Really shows the power of context. What about another one? Maybe the HAZOP reviews? I-2?
Right, HAZOPs, standard practice in oil and gas, a very structured hazard review process. In one big global oil company, which had a strong sort of command and control culture, where following established procedures was just how things were done, implementing HAZOPs went pretty smoothly.
Okay, culture alignment helped.
It seemed to. But then they tried to bring HAZOPs into another big global oil company they'd acquired or partnered with, also oil and gas. But this second company had much more independent business units. They were used to doing things their own way.
Ah, autonomy versus central control.
Exactly. So in the second company, there was less enthusiasm, maybe a feeling of box ticking just to comply, and people also felt they maybe didn't have the right local expertise to do the HAZOPs properly. So same industry, same basic process, but different organizational structure and maybe attitude led to much weaker implementation.
Fascinating. Even within the same sector, it's not plug and play. How about the manual handling training, I-3?
Yeah, the lifting training. In one place, a food manufacturing plant, it worked really well. They had a fairly stable workforce that used ergonomic principles, and they trained up local employees to be champions who could deliver the training and keep an eye on things. Seemed quite embedded.
Sounds effective.
But then, a similar program was tried in a huge national retailer with hundreds of stores, high staff turnover, much tougher going.
Why was that?
It seemed like there wasn't much visible push from senior management on safety. Things got bogged down in bureaucracy, getting approvals, even when money wasn't the main issue. The sheer scale and maybe the lack of leadership focus made it hard to get traction.
So frustrating when bureaucracy gets in the way of something that seems straightforward, like training. What about I-4, the risk assessment tool?
The risk assessment and tracker, yeah. That one saw much better uptake in a single large warehouse. The workforce there was seen as more stable, maybe more loyal, and management could monitor its use quite closely. There was a sense of ownership.
Okay, contained environment, stable team.
Right. But when they tried to roll out the same tool across like 30 retail stores spread out geographically with high staff turnover, less connection between employees and the overall business, adoption was way lower. People just didn't seem to engage with it in the same way.
That link between stability, employee connection, and adoption is interesting. Did the safety software, I-5, show similar patterns?
Very much so. The success of the safety data software really depended on two things. Was it integrated properly with the existing safety management systems they already used? And did senior managers actively support it and use the data it generated?
Makes sense. Integration and leadership.
Yeah. When it was just seen as this extra thing, another system to log into, maybe with limited enthusiasm from the top, it just didn't take off. Having good local guidelines and decent tech support from the vendor also helped, where it did work well.
So it can't feel like just another administrative burden. How about the big one? Safety culture transformation, I-6. That sounds ambitious.
It is. And the results reflected that. It was achieved successfully in one organization, but that was a smaller, quite centralized company. Critically, the board was actively involved, they provided dedicated resources, and they set up a specific new safety team to drive it.
So full commitment from the very top and resources to match.
Exactly. But it really struggled in a much larger, more decentralized organization. There, the board wasn't directly engaged in the same way. The safety teams were kind of siloed within different business units, reporting up through those units, not centrally. Without that unified vision and top-level push, trying to change the whole culture across disparate parts was incredibly difficult.
That really drives home the need for alignment, especially for those big system-wide changes. What about the last two, briefly, I-7 and I-8?
Right, I-7 was the competency test site in a small telecom company that was developed internally to fix a specific problem they had identified about skills. Because it was homegrown and targeted, it was seen as very effective.
Tailored solution.
And I-8 was a redesigned safety training program in a large organization. What made that one gain traction was how it explicitly linked senior managers' personal commitment and accountability to the outcomes. It wasn't just attend the training, it was make sure this training makes a difference in your area and you're responsible for that.
Putting accountability on leaders. Powerful. Okay, so we see context and leadership cropping up again and again. Did the research look at what actually triggered these organizations to try these new interventions in the first place?
Yes, they did touch on the triggers. It was quite varied. Sometimes it was clearly reactive. A series of similar accidents kept happening, and they realized their current approach wasn't working.
Okay, triggered by failure.
Or sometimes it was driven by industry norms, like everyone else in oil and gas uses AJs, so we probably should too. Peer pressure, almost.
Keeping up with the Joneses, safety style.
Kind of. And sometimes it was simply new regulations coming in that forced their hand. Interestingly, though, only a few of the interventions studied seemed to be truly proactive, strategic initiatives driven purely by the company wanting to get ahead of the curve on safety.
That's a bit sobering, isn't it? Suggests a lot of safety improvement might still be driven by reaction rather than foresight.
It does lean that way based on these examples, yeah.
Okay, so we've got the theory, the methods, these really rich examples from the results. Let's try to pull this all together now in the discussion. What are the big overarching lessons here?
I think the absolute key takeaway is this distinction between translatability and transformability.
Right.
Translatability is about how easy the idea seems to move. Is it simple, clear, not too embedded? But transformability is about how readily it can actually be adapted and integrated successfully into the new environment.
And the research suggests transformability is arguably more important for success.
That's what it strongly points towards, yes.
Yeah.
An intervention might look easy to translate, but if it can't be transformed or adapted to fit the local reality, it's likely to struggle or even fail. You need both, but transformability seems critical for actually making it work long term.
So you can have the most beautifully simple, clear intervention, but if the new context resists it or can't mold it, it won't stick. What about the role of the technical component we touched on? Software, specific equipment, detailed process.
Yeah, that's an interesting nuance. Many of these interventions had a strong technical piece. Even the administrative ones often relied on specific software or very prescribed steps. Now, that technical part can sometimes help translatability. It makes the intervention feel concrete, defined. You know what you're getting.
Right, less ambiguity.
But it can also hinder transformability. If the software is too rigid, if the process allows zero deviation, then it becomes much harder for local teams to make those necessary adjustments to fit their specific situation. It can become a barrier to adaptation.
So the very thing that makes it easy to define and move might make it hard to actually use effectively everywhere. A bit of a double-edged sword.
Exactly. Finding that balance is key. What about regulation? We often think of safety regs as just being restrictive. Did the research shed any light there?
That's a good question. The common view is often that regulation stifles flexibility.
And sometimes it can, if it's overly prescriptive and leaves no room for local judgment. But what this research found was quite interesting. Strong oversight, for example, from senior management, if it actively encouraged local adaptation within clear boundaries, could actually be really beneficial.
How so?
It goes back to that interpretive viability idea. If leadership says, okay, the non-negotiable goal is X safety outcome, but we trust you, the local team, to figure out the best way to achieve X in your context using this intervention as a starting point, that could be very powerful. It provides direction and empowers local adaptation.
So strong guidance on the what, but flexibility on the how, potentially encouraged by management oversight.
Precisely. It's a more nuanced view of how Oversight or even internal regulation can work. It doesn't have to be just about rigid compliance.
That's a really practical insight. Okay, let's circle back to translation competence. Based on everything we've discussed, what does that really look like for a safety professional trying to implement something new?
Well, it's definitely not just about knowing the safety rules. It's about being multifaceted. You need that deep understanding of the intervention itself, its history, its logic, its strengths and weaknesses.
What are the tool?
Then you absolutely need that deep dive into the receiving context, the culture, the politics, the existing processes, who are the key influencers, what are the potential roadblocks.
Know the environment.
And then critically, you need the strategic skill to adapt. When is it okay to just copy? When do you need to tweak things? When does the situation demand something fundamentally different, perhaps just inspired by the original idea? That judgment call is key.
Know how to adapt the tool for the environment.
Exactly. Plus, being aware of all those contextual factors that can make or break the implementation, leadership, resources, champions, etc. It's a real blend of technical knowledge, social intelligence, and strategic thinking.
It really sounds like a core competency for anyone involved in safety improvement. The research also kept highlighting specific contextual factors that seemed make or break. Can you just remind us of the top ones that really stood out as enabling success?
Yeah, there are definitely recurring themes. Number one, almost always, was active and visible senior management support. Not just lip service, but real championship from the top.
Crucial. What else?
Having engaged local champions, people on the ground, respected by their peers, who believe in the intervention and can help drive it, translate it for their colleagues.
The ground troops.
Absolutely. Then, adequate resourcing. Seems obvious, but making sure there's enough time, budget, maybe technical support, training that was vital. Lack of resources was a common killer.
Didn't do it on cheap.
The research also suggested that starting implementation within a narrower, more focused scope, maybe one department, one site, tended to work better initially than trying a massive big bang rollout across the whole organization.
Pilot it first, get it right, then expand.
Seems to be a more successful pattern, yeah.
Right.
And finally, integration, making sure the new intervention fits into existing workflows and systems rather than feeling like this completely separate extra task that people have to do on top of their real job.
Make it part of the way work is done, not an add-on.
Exactly. That helps with sustainability.
Those all make intuitive sense, but seeing them confirmed across different interventions and contexts is really powerful. And presumably the barriers were often just the flip side of these.
Pretty much, yes. Lack of visible leadership support, no local champions stepping up, insufficient resources, trying to boil the ocean by implementing everywhere at once, and interventions being perceived as just more bureaucracy or another form to fill out. These were all major barriers that cropped up repeatedly in the stories of failed transfers.
So it really is about cultivating that fertile ground for the intervention to actually take root and grow in its new home.
That's a great way to put it. You can't just throw the seed on barren rock and expect it to flourish.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. As we start to wrap up this deep dive, what's the single most important message you think people should take away from this research?
I think the core message is, don't underestimate the complexity of transferring safety interventions. It's not just about finding a best practice and copying it. Success hinges on a much more dynamic interplay between the intervention itself, its potential for adaptation, and the specific realities of the new context it's entering.
So it's about appreciating that nuance, moving beyond simple replication.
Yes. Think translation and transformation, not just transfer. Consider both the translatability of the idea and, crucially, its transformability within the new setting.
Got it. And what are the key practical implications then? If someone listening is thinking about bringing in a new safety approach, what should they focus on based on this?
Well, practically, it really reinforces some key actions. First, work hard to get genuine, visible buy-in from senior leaders. Make the business case.
Okay, leadership first.
Second, actively identify and empower those local champions. Give them time, training, recognition. They are invaluable.
Find your allies.
Third, be realistic about resources. Allocate proper time, budget, and support. Don't set it up to fail.
Resource it properly.
Fourth, consider starting smaller. Pilot the intervention, learn the lessons in a focused area before going wide.
Test and learn.
And fifth, think carefully about integration from the start.
Yeah.
How can this become part of the normal workflow, not just another task tacked on?
Embed it in the process.
Those 5 things, leadership, champions, resources, focus, scope, and integration, seem to be consistently critical based on these findings.
Really valuable practical takeaways there. It's about being strategic, being context aware, and engaging people effectively. Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of why good safety ideas sometimes travel poorly, and more importantly, how we can get better at making them work in new places.
Absolutely. Applying these ideas of translation, thinking about how ideas move and change, it can really shift how we approach safety improvements.
It really can. And just to leave our listeners with something to mull over, considering everything we've discussed today, maybe think about your own organization. Are there safety practices currently used in one part that could perhaps be more effectively shared or adapted elsewhere, maybe in a different team, a different site, or even with partner organizations you work with?
That's a great question to ask.
And thinking about that, what steps could you or your organization take to consciously build that translation competence we talked about? How can you get better at understanding, adapting, and implementing safety ideas effectively across different contexts? Definitely some food for thought there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.